Thank you, Mr. President. And to my friend from West Virginia, I appreciate the opportunity to take the floor. I want to change subjects just a little bit, if I may, and talk to you about a concern that I have with one of the President's priorities in his 2018 fiscal year budget. And that priority is Yucca Mountain. Specifically, the President included $120 million in his budget for the Department of Energy to restart licensing activities for the Yucca Mountain Nuclear Waste Repository. As a proponent and author of the legislation called No Budget, No Pay, which would restore regular order to the budget and appropriations process, I'm pleased to see the President did submit to Congress a detailed budget proposal. As a small government fiscal conservative, I hope that this new administration would focus on budget priorities that would reduce duplicative spending and streamline programs in order to save taxpayer dollars. You can imagine my disappointment, Mr. President, that they instead decided to prioritize funding to restart licensing activities for a failed proposal. Now, Mr. President, over the past few weeks, I've outlined on the Senate floor some of the issues with Yucca Mountain, whether it be the crippling effect that it would have on Nevada's economy or the public safety issues associated with transportation of this nuclear waste. I'll continue to come down to the floor to educate my colleagues on the many issues associated with Yucca Mountain because, plain and simple, it is not a viable option for the long-term storage of our nation's nuclear waste. Instead of throwing more taxpayer dollars at a failed proposal, it should be working on a real long-term solution rooted in consent-based siting. Now, you've heard me, Mr. President, raise a question that many Nevadans are thinking. Why should a state without any nuclear power plants of its own be forced against its will to house all of the nation's nuclear waste? I stand by the Department of Energy's 2010 decision to terminate the Yucca Mountain program. And I stand by its 2015 recommendation on a consent-based siting. Mr. President, Yucca Mountain is dead. But let me take a moment to walk you through what it would take to put this failed program back on life support. Prior to suspension of the program in 2010, the federal government spent close to $15 billion on Yucca Mountain. And now I recognize that some of my colleagues may say, well, the government has already spent this much money on the repository. Shouldn't we complete it? First of all, let me state that restarting the Yucca Mountain program would mean spending $2 billion more just to complete the licensing process. $1.66 billion to the Department of Energy and $330 million for the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. And after 3 to 5 years spent on licensing, there could well be another 5 years in legal challenges. There's no certainty that Yucca Mountain would ever be built. Second, even if Yucca Mountain were to go forward, it would be an expensive repository project. The Department of Energy's best estimate is that another $82 billion, let me repeat that, another $82 billion would be needed to license, litigate, build, operate, decommission, and eventually close Yucca Mountain. On top of that money that's already been spent, that adds up to more than $96 billion for what is called the total system life cycle cost. That leads to my third point. We need to reevaluate the whole nuclear waste cost question. There's a business case to be made against Yucca Mountain. The Department of Energy's own estimates for Yucca Mountain say that the Nuclear Waste Fund will only pay about 80% of the total life cycle costs, or about $77 billion. The remaining $19 billion will have to come from an annual appropriations voted by this Congress. That means more money for this project paid by taxpayers. But it does not have to be that way. In 2012, the Department of Energy did its own cost assessment and concluded that all other costs, like transportation, being equal, walking away from Yucca Mountain and starting with a new repository site in a deep salt bed or a deep shale formation would actually save between $12 billion and $27 billion over the life of the repository. Before we spend any more taxpayer dollars on Yucca Mountain, we need to ask the Department of Energy experts to come before us and explain what they learned about repository costs in their previous studies. Beyond that, we need new cost studies on geologic disposal and repositories, studies that include the lessons learned from recent progress with repositories in Europe, and new studies that look at the nuclear waste program system overall and incorporate the cost of safe on-site storage at reactors, early removal of spent fuel from shut-down reactors, and consolidated interim storage facilities as recommended by the Blue Ribbon Commission on America's Nuclear Future. It is clear that rather than forcing the state of Nevada to accept nuclear waste at a scientifically unsound site, taxpayer dollars would be better spent identifying viable alternatives for the long-term storage of nuclear waste in areas that are willing to house it. Finding alternatives is a common-sense path forward, as well as a fiscally responsible decision. I urge my colleagues, as we continue the budget appropriation process for this next fiscal year, to conduct oversight over the life cycle costs of repositories, and to focus on further implementing the Department of Energy's consent-based siting process instead of wasting more taxpayers' dollars on a failed proposal. So, Mr. President, I stand ready to partner with my colleagues on both sides of the aisle on this issue, confident that together we can find a solution to this problem once and for all.